This is Unfragmented, inspired by Colossians 1, verses 16 and 17. For by him were all things created that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him, and he is before all things, and by him all things consist. Welcome to Unfragmented, where we explore the cohesion of things believed with things done. Today is August 9th. 2023. I'm Kevin Novak, and I'm joined by Lee Bortons, Nicole Parks, Michelle Knapp, and Jennifer X. So Emma Bortons is also our producer. So we're happy to have everyone here this week and have a lively discussion. Now, last week, just to remind you, we spoke about Shekels with Shackles, which was that's a compilation of articles put together by the Christian Education Initiative. You can reach their website at christedu.org. And those articles are about school choice, which you should know. You could revisit the conversation from last week, but school choice is a humanistic model. We talked about the dangers of taking civil government money for education. And we talked about how wealth distribution or redistribution is improper. And what we really need is education freedom. We need to be able to have the civil government out of teaching, learning, and discipleship. You can learn more about that, the end goal of abolition, at deconstructingthecoliseum.com. And this week, I just want to talk a little in wrapping up our conversation about Shekels with Shackles and just revisit something that Dr. Marlene McMillan had talked about in her Chapter 5 article, Vouchers Without Choice, and this deals with entitlement. One of the false premises that she talks about is that children are entitled to their fair share of public monies used for education in their school district. And I just want to explore that word, entitlement. We use that a lot. I know I do too, and we don't necessarily define it. And as we've been talking about through Unfragmented, it's good to define words. So Lee, I'll ask you, how do you define entitlement?
Yeah, I was thinking about that just as a definition. It's things that you feel like somehow are a right or universally given, something that's inalienable that is yours, and you're mad if you don't get it.
So, I mean, do you think of an entitlement as being, does it connote to you like a Christian thing, or is it a humanistic thing?
I would say as a Christian, the only thing I'm entitled to do is die on a cross. I mean, right?
Well, that's good. Yeah, and we're not, and you're certainly not entitled to someone else's money, are you?
Or their time, or their life, or their property, or their liberty. All those things are their own, and it's a blessing when they share it with you.
Mm-hmm. I like that. It's good.
Yeah.
Jennifer, I'll ask you, one of the things I think of when I think of entitlement is I do remember, and I haven't had a chance to explore this dictionary as much as I'd like to, but the old early 1800s Webster's dictionary, I carry a copy of the definition of religion. And one of the definitions of religion, as they defined it back then, was basically Christianity in a broad sense, but in a more narrow sense, the duties and obligations that we owe to our Creator. How would you define a duty or a right?
A duty or a right?
Yeah.
Well, I do, right off the bat, they sound different to me. A duty is something that I am obligated to do, and a right is, so a duty is something that I owe to someone else, and a right is something that is owed to me, that I have. Well, I hate to use the word in its definition, but I have the right to have, or the right to do. I have the freedom to exercise whatever that right is.
Mm-hmm.
Duty is something that I owe to someone else.
Well, and I'm thinking too, like you might have the right to receive something, like even in a contractual sense. If you are going to cut someone's grass, then, you know, if there's an agreement, they're going to pay you, presumably. So in that regard, but you've earned it, so it wouldn't necessarily be an entitlement. Do you see a difference between a right slash duty and an entitlement?
Yes, I think so. An entitlement, when I think of an entitlement or somebody that has an entitled attitude, it's someone that believes they are owed something without any input or irrespective of any circumstance. When someone is entitled to something, then it doesn't matter what other circumstance there is, they should get that thing. A right, I think, kind of like you're saying in the sense of a contract, especially, is something that is more earned, or it's a little bit more conditional. You know, rights that we have in our country are conditional on our citizenship in this country. You know, other rights may have other conditions.
That's good. Is the word entitlement, you made me think about the fact that the word title is in there, and a title, like a title to a land or title to a car, that it strikes me as its root must have to do something with contracts. And we get upset with the word when there's no contract. It's just a demand.
Like something, yeah, like something you are owed, like in the liberal sense, an entitlement or humanistic sense, something you are owed, but that you don't receive. Like student loan forgiveness, I think, is something that's been in the news. I think people were almost acting like they were owed it just because they had to pay a lot of money for college when they were the ones that decided to do that, to go to college. But and so the one thing I do want to drive at here, though, is, you know, we've got these duties owed to God and these rights. Is there any biblical basis or authority in Scripture for some type of entitlement? Michelle, what do you think about that?
I actually thought of Luke 16:13, where it says, "No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." And in our country now, that's what we look at as an entitlement, is that we are receiving money for something that we believe is due us.
Interesting.
Well, and this is, so I do want to use this now to transition into the beautiful tree, because in the beginning, you know, we're seeing right away with James Tooley's book, The Beautiful Tree, which we'll be talking about. I take the book jacket off, by the way. I'm not a fan of book jackets, but I like my books to look rough and rustic and beat up. And by the way, coincidentally, my book is autographed by James Tooley. I just bought this. I bought this like 8 years ago off of Amazon, and I got a little lucky. But anyway, so in transitioning into The Beautiful Tree, which, like I said, we'll be talking about all this month, the rest of August, and in using what we just talked about with entitlement and transitioning, contrasting that really with the beginning part of the book, I'll ask you first, in terms of the title of the book and how far we've gotten into it and how far you've gotten into, do we know yet what The Beautiful Tree, what the title is about that?
Well, I know because I looked it up, but in the first 3 chapters, as we're talking about tonight, it's not defined that I could find it. Nicole, did you find a definition in the first few, or?
No, it's mentioned later on in the book, so I don't want to give any spoilers.
Yeah, we can wait. Unless Kevin wants us to spoil it.
No,
I don't mind.
Well, if you want to share with us what it is, and then we can keep that in mind as we go forward.
It was just a term Gandhi used for whatever reason. I didn't see where it originated, but he would describe the schools that were pre-colonial era of British in India. And what it made me think about was how In classical conversations, we're always, talking about how we have to get a church, a facility, and those kind of things. And I always think, yeah, but if we were ever in a desperate situation, why can't we study like Abraham did under a tree? Why don't we meet around oak trees? And I think that's where the title must have come from, because the families would sit in the cool of the shade and have some school.
Well, it doesn't get more simple than that. And as we can see early in this book, we don't need it to get much more complex than that. If you don't mind, we can read. I'd like to read just one excerpt here, and then just ask a couple of questions about it. I'm not sure if there are different versions out there, but the excerpt I'd like us to go over here first is at the bottom of page 2. And I think this is going to set the tone for discussion of the book and really what Tooley is dealing with at the beginning. Nicole, do you have at the bottom of page 2 that last true paragraph beginning with read the development literature?
Yes.
Do you see that at the bottom of page? Do you mind reading that paragraph and then just to the bold there that ends in January 2000?
Mm-hmm. Read the development literature, hear the speeches of our politicians, listen to our pop stars and actors, and above all, the poor come across as helpless. Helplessly, patiently, they must wait until governments and international agencies acting on their behalf provide them with a decent education. So we need to give them more. It's urgent. Action, not words. It's all I believed during my early years in Zimbabwe. But my journey has made me suspect that it was, however well-intentioned, missing something crucial. Missing from the accepted wisdom in any sense of what the poor can do or already doing for themselves. It's a journey that changed my life. Something quite remarkable is happening in developing countries today that turns the accepted wisdom on its head. I first discovered this for myself in January 2000.
Well, Jennifer, what do you think it is that was quite remarkable? What is it that James Tooley here discovered that was quite remarkable on page 3 there?
Well, when I was at this point in the book, I did not know, but having read a little further, I do have an idea. Do you want me to speak from my position, my perspective as I was reading it, or as I know now?
As you know now, yeah. Well, either way, whatever is a little more interesting.
Well, I did not know when I was at that point in the book, but having read a little further, he found that people were taking their educations into their own hands and creating these private schools, and were really taking ownership. Families were taking ownership of the education of their own children. Without this action, not words, without this giving more and this urgency, calling upon governments essentially and donors to provide that education. Families were taking it into their own hands.
Well, and what I find refreshing about this book, I've read it before, I read it in 2015, is that James Tooley is not necessarily coming at it like one of us would, where we're kind of already predisposed to looking at a certain way. Refreshingly, he's being intellectually honest here. And there aren't that many people that write that way, or not as many as before. But Lee, I want to ask you, in looking at what Tooley discovered, I mean, how does what he saw in India and Ghana and Nigeria, like, compare and contrast with how we live our homeschool lives?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it depends really what you mean, because I don't send my children to school. They're actually with me, and he's looking at opportunities for children to be educated in a circumstance mostly apart from their parents, but their parents seem to be very close by because they are either small villages or blocks in a slum, and they know where mom and dad are going to be. So I didn't find a lot of comparisons between homeschooling in a rich country like the United States and what they're doing. What I did find, though, was the attitude. The parents would do whatever it took to get their children educated. And one thing about the passage you had us read, I find the whole thing incredibly insulting. First, until about 100 years ago, almost everybody was equally poor. So poverty has nothing to do with anything else. It is just, it's a state of nature, and it just so happens that we've lived through the richest 100 years of history, and we are extremely lucky, and what we've lived through is not normal. What they deal with is absolutely normal. And what happens is these rich Western ideas come in and try to make them be socialized instead of working as a family and as the local community. The other thing I find so insulting about these kind of attitudes is I happen to be, and I'm going to bet maybe one of you were also, I happen to be one of those little children who taught myself to read. As soon as somebody showed me there was a code, I figured it out. It had nothing to do with my wealth. There are Black people, slaves, Indians, people in the slums of China that are as equally smart as I am. Education is something that they just do because they're curious and they want to know things. And to act like the level of income they have is what determines their outcome is probably why they remain poor, because we don't leave them alone and let them do what they should do. How's that for a little bit of a stamped foot?
That's awesome. I'm a little adrenalized now. I feel like maybe going outside and doing some sprints. But, you know, actually, I'm glad you said that, because I have one more question, then we can move on to another paragraph. But how did it, one of the things I wanted to know, and I know this is going to sound cliche, but I really want to know an answer to this if you have one. How did it come to be that the accepted wisdom was that there's this positive correlation between how much we spend on education, or how much, you know, what your financial background is, and what kind of education you receive? How did that come about?
Michelle, do you have any idea? Do you want to answer that one?
I think it came about because we had the money. And so after World War II, when there was that economic boom, I mean, I'm not an economist by any stretch of the imagination. This is all just, you know, the little stuff that floats around in Michelle Knipp's head. But I feel like that we got reckless with our money, and we had this idea that, yes, life is better with money. And with more money, you can do more things. But yet, when you start reading the old books, the old literature, like one of my favorites from Challenge A was Ralph Moody's When Father and I Were Ranchers. They were dirt poor, but they had everything. And they had a ranch, and they would get up in the morning and they would do their chores. And schooling was done after the sun went down and the fire was burning, and everybody got around the fireplace and mom read to them. And now all of a sudden, with the baby boom generation, which I'm at the tail end of the boomers, it became, you have to have this, you have to have that, we have to have our rights, we have to have this, it just all became, I think it's the money. That's what I think it is. And as he clearly defines later in the book, that's what his colleagues think too, because he has story after story again and again. And I will say this really quickly. When we were at the end of our meeting last week, and we were talking about the money that parents feel that they're entitled to, and they can put it where they want, the thing that kept going through my mind is, but what about the poor? What about the inner cities in our country? And then this was a gift. It was like, there was my answer. And he starts to lay this out. So because I think that is going to be the question that we say, we have to do this because we have people that are poor. And I think what he's showing here in this book is that the people that have these children, they don't have the education, but they see the necessity of a good education. And they also see the corruption that happens in the institutionalized education. So that's where they're taking it into their own hands. They don't have the education to say, I'm going to do this. I can read, I can do this. I can stay one step ahead. But I think a lot of these families don't, but they know the importance of it, and their communities are coming together to provide that opportunity for them.
Okay, well, just so you know, I love money, but I think Michelle's right too. So Nicole, you wanted to share something with us.
Yeah, or was Jennifer going to go first? I can't remember.
One of you two, whoever it was.
We were both doing chapter 2.
Mm-hmm.
I think my paragraph might be before yours. I think mine might lead into yours a little bit.
Okay.
So I'm looking on page 23 of the book. It's, I guess, the second to last paragraph in that book, or on that page, if you're following along in the book, and the paragraph starts following Sajitha Bashir's lead. But I want to read a portion that's a little further down. This is an excerpt from a report called India Development and Participation. And it looks like it was written in 1998. And so the author of this report says, it starts with universal elementary education on page 23. Universal elementary education is a realizable goal, he had written, if only it is made a more lively political issue. More government spending is needed, I read, and government must be more actively involved in opening more schools, improving the infrastructure, appointing more teachers, simplifying the curriculum, organizing enrollment drives, providing free textbooks, and so on. And he the author of this report trots out the standard line on private education, that the privileged classes are the main clients of unaided private schools. This was all standard fare. Private education is about the elites and has nothing to do with universal primary education, which is the stuff of governments and politics. There is nothing in this, this excerpt comes from the conclusion of that report, and there is nothing there to upset the development apple cart. And so I found that interesting, and I was wondering if that sounds familiar to where we're at. Kevin, I think this kind of is related to the question you were asking, like, where does this idea come from that the solution is money and the solution is the government? That was the conclusion in this report, that the solution is that the government needs to do more. The government needs to open more schools, improve the infrastructure, provide free textbooks, simplify the curriculum. I found that one interesting. I was wondering what your guys' thoughts on this was. Does that sound familiar, and does it sound true?
So I actually have that highlighted in yellow as one of the ones I was going to talk about too. And the reason that struck me, not just what you just said about the money side of things, but this phrase, universal. All this is right out of the UN, and universal basic income and universal elementary schools and universal, it's showing that they believe that there's a one world government that's the only solution to this. How dare a father think he might be able to make the right choices for his family?
Well, and I think a lot of it does come down to attitude. I think that, I was just thinking, this isn't the best example, but I remember when I had graduated from law school, there were some people upset about like the opportunities that were presented to the law school through the law school to the graduates, in other words, job opportunities. And I was a little surprised by that, because maybe it was because I was a few years older. It never occurred to me that the law school would be responsible for me getting a job. That never occurred to me. And I was a little surprised when some people were upset about that, or at least the law school would be a conduit to it. Even the money that I paid them, it never occurred to me that they were supposed to help me. That was foreign to me. And so I think, this goes back to what Lee was talking about earlier. A lot of people who are raised poor don't even know it, because it's an attitude. It's something that you might be somewhat aware of because you don't have a lot of things, but you make do. And I think there was, along with what Michelle was talking about, just this shift in thinking along the way. But yeah, I think that is true, that paragraph there. And I think it comes down to attitude. That's inextricable with the money And there are other parts too, like maybe more people are more inclined to covet or be envious of others, things like that.
Well, I think the thing that's inherently flawed in the entire statement is the things they described have nothing to do with education and everything to do with schools. There's not a thing in here that that talks about helping people to learn so they can improve their minds and appreciate truth, goodness, and beauty, and be able to have the ability to not just choose what they want to do, but to choose the things they should want to do. There's nothing about this in any of the documents that Tooley is giving to us that come from government sources. And yet the beauty of the whole book and the joy of it is every time he talks to a parent, you get this really positive story about what education is. Because it's not school, it's education.
And I think the teachers too, the private school teachers that he ends up discovering, he finds that joy in what they're doing, the headmasters and the teachers that the headmasters hire and train, basically. But what I thought of when you were reading this, Jennifer, all I kept thinking of was Saul Alinsky, and wherever you can find a way to divide people, you can. And, there's the privileged classes and the poor. So we have to create a wedge between the two classes. And the last couple of books, the neo-Marxism, that it's the government and we know better. And as we go on, we find that in the countries he was at, there wasn't a difference in the infrastructure between the government-run schools and the private schools. And like Kevin said, those kids don't know that they're poor. That's how they live. And it's normal to them.
So what I hear you saying, I think, each of you in a little different ways, is that it's where the responsibility lies. Does the responsibility lie at the feet of the government to educate our children, or does the responsibility lie with the family? And when we as the family hand that responsibility over to the government to do it, then these things that have more to do with school than education are what we hear from them. This is what you need. This is what you need. Once we give them the responsibility, they can tell us what we need, and this is what they're telling to us. And if we've handed them the responsibility, we're maybe not we personally, but parents, families are believing that, and this all becomes nothing to upset the apple cart.
I think what this whole book does is so wonderful is it reiterates the month we have with George Gilder's knowledge and power. And the only thing government can ever do is plan, and to make their plans occur the way they want them to do, they have to stop people. Versus knowledge and power is enterprise and surprising. And that's what's so wonderful about this book, is the surprise that Tooley expresses at parents who will sacrifice so much, and at teachers that'll be so innovative in coming up with various systems of education and schooling so they can help their neighbors. And they're able to be successful at it because it is surprising and different. It's not part of anybody's plan.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I had noted here on page 13 where one of the teachers says, "I'm not a teacher, but an awakener." And I was like, wow, I've got like just the whole page here of things like that. And it's very inspiring. So, but
because of time, I want to ask Nicole, how did your passage tie in then with Jennifer? Can you move on and share that with us?
Yeah, so Tooley kind of talks about other reports he's reading, and from one of the reports he reads about why there's supposedly success in private schools for the poor, it says, in a private school, the teachers are accountable to the manager who can fire them, and through him or her to the parents who can withdraw their children. In a government school, the chain of accountability is much weaker, as teachers have a permanent job with salaries and promotions unrelated to performance. And that was on page 25. Forgot to say that.
Okay, we're on 25, top,
yeah,
bottom.
Bottom paragraph, page 25, towards the bottom. So he's saying the report is very clear that is coming, from some of these same people, that a success might be is because there's accountability, because the teachers can be fired, the parents have the say in what they can do with their money, contrasted with in government schools where parents have no say. So I was just thinking, like, how, I mean, kind of what I had said, like, how do we see that already in America, in that similarities in that or differences?
Well, and this book was written, about a dozen years ago now. I forgot to look at the date. And so if you'd read it when he first wrote it, it'd be easy to say, well, this won't happen in the United States. It's not this way. And in the last 3 years, we're approaching the same kind of conditions he describes in the later chapters when we actually get into what each of the schools that are private and why the parents go there, because the public schools become basically, they're empty. There one school he described, they had 36 students and 35 teachers, and they couldn't fire the teachers because they were government employees. So the accountability part.
Yeah, I think in the United States, clearly with the pandemic, that was just, it was opening a can of worms when the parents realized, when they were sitting there on the cameras with their student and hearing the things that they were learning. And I thought was the catalyst for all of the board meetings and the parents showing up at the Board of Education meetings, because I think they were appalled. I think that, they were thinking it was still Leave It to Beaver time. And, and their experiences in school.
Well, how does our culture get to the point where they think that a time when the family was whole and one parent could afford to work and the other one could afford to stay home while the other worked, would somehow inculcate a different the same educational model as a time where children don't even know who their parents are. Half of boys are born without their father in their household. And so many of our children are part of divorce and multiple remarriages. Like, why would we even think that culturally we would be the same? It's all very much a puzzle.
We're watching too much TV.
What
if you're watching Leave It to Beaver, though?
Yeah, that's what they should be watching.
Yeah, okay. They should, definitely.
So, Nicole, did you want to add anything else before we move on to Michelle's passage?
No, Michelle can continue.
Thank you.
Okay. So I sort of flip-flopped this. I was going to use this as an exordium and then go back. So I'll just do it as an exordium. He wrote, one of the schoolmasters that he was working with to help him collect this research on the positive impact that these private schools have for poor children in their own neighborhoods he told him, he said, we don't cherish qualifications, we cherish your output. And this has to do with the teachers. Can you perform? That is the important thing, not whatever certificates you have. And so when he's doing his hiring, that's his lens. So how does that compare to the hiring of teachers in U.S. private schools? What do you think that the headmasters are looking for in our U.S. private schools?
I would think where so many private schools in the U.S. particularly are still very similar to government schools, and that they are a lot of times looking at the same qualifications. I think there are some schools with exceptions where they're maybe not looking at that certificate, but they are probably going to prioritize somebody with their certificate over somebody that doesn't, just because that is just the overall mentality of how we view education in America, including private schools, because private schools in America are still supposed to be better and more elite.
Think about what happened with because I believe in the division of labor when it comes to work, but I don't believe in the division of labor when it comes to learning. Because if you don't do your own heavy lifting, you don't learn. And so where all this came out of was when you got something like the University of Michigan, which has 100,000 plus students every single year, they needed some way to weed people out to know what applicants to take. And so the certification process is really in many ways a result of the division of labor and how they put the factory model into the schools. And so if you have to run an institution that has 20,000 applicants, a number is super helpful. And so that's where the certifications came from.
Yeah.
Well, I don't, legally speaking, I'm not sure if states differ, but the state where I live, you do have to have a certificate. You have to be a certified teacher to teach in a public school, but you do not have to have a certificate to teach in a private school. The legal qualifications to teach in a private school here are just that you are able to teach. And so I know that I can't speak for, most private schools, but I know that there's a private school in the very small town where I live. And I know some of the folks that they've hired for teachers, and some of them are just parents, like me, homeschooling my kids with no more qualifications than I have. And so I have actually, Michelle, I was wondering that very same thing. I had that same question as I was reading through this. And I was wondering then, because of the small experience I have here in this town, is just how much that differs across private schools across the country. And we're just one country, I don't know if there are states where a certificate is still required. And Nicole, I would agree with you that even this one private school that I know of would probably still prioritize someone with those sort of qualifications over just a parent. I don't know.
The whole idea that because I believe very much in certification. It's not in the way they mean here, though. I believe very much in the certification in the sense that it's a reference, that if Michelle tells me I was in a Bible study with Nicole and she did really well, then that's the Michelle Knapp stamp of approval, right? There's nothing wrong with it. But what becomes wrong is when it's government mandated rather than allowing the innovation to occur, and the person running the business or the parent educating the child getting to decide who should be supporting them. And instead they have to take the one that's got the certificate the government approved. It's just backwards.
Yeah. So he said on page 41, and I am looking on my Kindle. So it starts with the sentence, I spent a lot of time observing. So I spent a lot of time observing the classes in BSE's school and in every other private school I visited unannounced, with the occasional exception the teachers were teaching when I visited. In the rare case when a teacher was off sick, the principal had given the children work and was keeping an eye on their progress. The name Lucky, he was a typical teacher. He was 23, had just completed his high school diploma and wanted to go to college to study economics. He couldn't afford to do that. So he continued living where he was brought up in Makoko and taught. He told me that he felt privileged to be a teacher. When I am teaching, I am also learning. When I'm teaching children that the square on the hypotenuse is equal to the squares on the other two sides, I have to think deeply, why is that the case? And I find I learn all sorts of new things for myself. He was clearly enthusiastic about teaching and engaged all the children with him. His commitment and passion made him exactly the sort of teacher you would want for yourself or your own children. And he goes on. So I wanted to ask, how do we define a lead learner? Is that who he was? Was he the lead learner in that classroom and at that school?
Well, what jumped out to me right away. Oh, go ahead, Kevin.
No, you go ahead, Jennifer. Thank you.
Are you sure? I was just going to say that what jumped out to me right away is that the things that what made him the sort of teacher that you'd want for yourself or your own children was not necessarily a certification, which I agree with you, Lee. Like, it depends on from whom that certification comes, how valuable it is. But that wasn't what made him the teacher you would want. It was his commitment and his passion. He was, like you said earlier, Kevin, an awakener. Because of his own passion, he could awaken that passion in the kids.
Yeah, and Michelle's lifelong learning question, you can see how he just recognized I don't have to go to college. If I teach a child something, I'll learn it better myself.
Yeah.
I had not heard the term lead learner before. Is that a CC term? I mean, I got a good idea what it means, but I like that. That's really good. But I think Lee, I don't think what you were talking about was certification need to be limited to this, but I'm also like in favor of certification, but I mean, and I think we actually need more of it. But again, it's who is it coming from? You know, I remember one of the local radio hosts had like a plumber on, and this plumber was like the head of not a union, but basically a trade group. And the radio host was asking him about like the civil government takeover of the plumbing standards. And he really didn't understand what the radio host was getting at. The radio host was saying there's nothing wrong with standards. We need standards, but who's making the standards? And so we need certifications, we need certificates, we need programs, we need all those things. And that also will drive people to learn more. I know my brother is in tech, and he's always getting these different certifications, making classes and all that. And I think that's good. But, you know, when we look at why someone wants to learn, again, you know, we alluded to this earlier, it's hard to teach that. You know, you want to have an understanding of God's creation, but incentive is what I see here. You know, where a lot of these people, they have some incentive to be there. But that incentive hasn't gone away just because they got hired. You know, they might be on some kind of probation period. There's incentive to do well. There's incentive to please the parents. There's incentive to teach just as well as that person would like to be taught, the golden rule. And when you oftentimes use generalization, most times you get hired by civil government, well, those incentives go away.
Right.
Why should you do a good job? You don't need to do a good job anymore. So,
well, there was a lot of really good stuff and happy stuff in these 3 chapters, and I look forward to more happy situations of hearing how families have worked things out. So, Michelle, do you want to have a closing thought, and then Kevin can pray?
You know, the one thing that I really giggled at was when he was talking about that you might throw 600 kids out because they can't keep up with the financial requirements of the government. And he said, when you have a headache, the solution is not to cut off the head. So it's like, and so his point is to, you know, why can't you help work with what it is that you have? And it doesn't necessarily take money, but anyway, I thought that was hilarious.
Yeah. Why cut off the head? Okay, well, I look forward to the next 3 weeks, and so we'll work on the next 3 chapters. And Kevin, go ahead, close this.
All right. Well.
Wait, Michelle. Yeah. Wait, Michelle's going to give her little spiel.
Okay, I was afraid to say it. I thought I had to be all intellectual. So if you like what it is that you're seeing, would you please hit that like button and subscribe? Because that's going to help us get out there. And other people are going to find us, and they will enjoy it as much as you are. So thank you.
All right. Well, this is great. Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this enthusiasm that you brought to us. And so oftentimes we're unnecessarily focused on the problems. And we're so inspired by James Tooley, even if he didn't mean to inspire us the way that he is doing that. But he sees so many things around the world, so many ways that you're working, and even with your general revelation, where we know people who don't necessarily put their trust in your son and his ways, that they are able to still be successful in following your paths and just discipling and learning and understanding your creation. So we thank you for that enthusiasm, and we just pray that we can continue to be that way, not just for the rest of this month as we study what Mr. Tooley has brought to us, but also in our own paths, our own journeys, and our own discipleship and learning of your creation. I pray all these things in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, team. See you next
Thank
week.
you.
All right.
See you next week.